Sometimes reviewers agree with manufacturers to help tune their headphones or IEMs. From my understanding, this relationship basically consists of a reviewer emphasizing their personal sound preferences and the manufacturer hoping that this will result in a product which will appeal to a large group. Of course, the name recognition of the particular reviewer might guarantee that at least subscribers to that reviewer will be enticed to buy the product. A couple of IEMs and headphones of late have been delivered under this type of arrangement. Today, we take a look at the Tripowin Mele, which is a three-way collaboration between a reviewer on YouTube, Tripowin, and Linsol. Linsol sent me the Mele to review. As you probably know, Linsol is among a handful of online resellers that specializes in hi-fi gear. You can find all sorts of popular and obscure stuff on Linsol's website. The Mele is $50. How amazing can it be? Tripowin calls the Mele the Ultra Performance Budget IEM. They say this IEM was created with the audiophile community in mind. Tripowin specifically says that this product promises supreme audio performance and professional tuning. The Mele uses Tripowin's proprietary AccuTune dynamic driver. This is apparently the first time the driver has been used. They say this dual magnet design allows them to fine-tune their sound signature. Tripowin says that they use the Blonde BL03 as the starting point for the Mele sound. They claim they took the sound of the BL03 and emphasized the sub-bass, reduced the mid-bass, and tuned a more balanced treble transition. Tripowin says that the Mele improves upon the BL03 soundstage, resolution, and detail retrieval. I have to emphasize that it's been a very long time since I've seen a manufacturer give reasonably clear ideas about the tuning of their product. If you've heard the BL03, then Tripowin's description of the Mele probably makes a bit of sense. Tripowin says that they use premium materials in the Mele's construction. I can confirm that the Mele is built fairly well. The IEM is housed in a metal casing. The back of the IEM has a black and white design, or a white and gold one, depending on the version you buy. The Mele is not really made to conform to your ears. It's got an elongated body. This IEM will sit in your ear cavity, but it will not be a secure contoured fit that you'll get from true IEMs. Nevertheless, the Mele does sit in the ear without difficulty. The Mele comes with your standard silicone ear tips, and you get 3 pairs. They're perfectly agreeable, but nothing special. You also get a hard shell case. It's fairly roomy, easily holds the IEM with its cable and ear tips without having to jam them all together. The cable is probably among the best I've seen on any IEM. I know this is a selling point for the Mele, and frankly, I can agree. It's a big improvement over competitors in this price range and higher. It's simply a nice looking and nice feeling cable. You can choose among several connection options when you purchase on Linsol's website. Funny enough, Linsol's website shows photos of filters with a pair of tweezers. I got the impression that both of these accessories would be included in the box, but they weren't. As for comfort, the Mele is a fairly comfortable IEM. It's light but still chunky. It's a definite improvement in fit and comfort over the BL03 for me, but it's similar in these regards to the BL05S. I can wear the Mele for about 2 to 3 hours without trouble. These IEMs do need a bit of adjustment from time to time, however, and may become dislodged with vigorous head shaking. Overall, the Mele's construction is perfectly agreeable. It's nothing special in this price range, however. We've got sturdy metal construction from other manufacturers in this price category. The Mele's accessories for the most part are agreeable. There's nothing to complain about. Instead, the quality cable and your choice of terminations is a breath of fresh air. To test the Mele, I used it with various gear. I paired it with my RME 80i2 DAC, the Modi Liquid Spark Stack, my EcoZerta ITM03, and of course the Sony NW-ZX507. I used the stock accessories. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The Mele is easy to drive. Like other IEMs I've used, you don't need an amplifier. If you want to pair an amp with it, then a moderately powerful one is plenty. Feel free to use the Mele with your phone or laptop through their respective audio jacks, if they still have one. Adding amplification, however, results in slightly greater clarity. Tripowin says that they took the BL03 sound and emphasized the sub-bass while reducing the mid-bass. My tests indicate that the Mele has slightly elevated sub-bass and noticeably elevated mid-bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a low rumble from the beginning of the song. The Mele was able to recreate this detail. When the crescendo hit, the organ cut through the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was audible but did not overwhelm the other instruments. There was noticeable melding among each instrument and at best average clarity among them. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the back until they were shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This is supposed to pan from right to left to center. The Mele recreated the sound of rolling marbles, but it was a little muted. The Mele also did not pan the sound. There are multiple drums in this track. The Mele rendered all of them, but there was a lot of melding between each drum hit. Drum impact was hard but not piercing. It was evident that the mid-bass was elevated, which resulted in drums always sounding louder than the other instruments in this track. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, Newpatech, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the Mele fully recreated the sub-bass. The subwoofer sounded like it was about 5 feet away. The drums were louder than the sub-bass. Vocals were often overshadowed by the drum impacts. The vocals seemed to lack a bit of their sparkle, which is something I rarely encounter during my testing. I would say that the vocals were actually one step behind the drums. I listened to my Sicario soundtrack. I used these songs to listen for any audible distortion in the bass region. I listened from low volume all the way up and beyond my personal safe threshold, and I could not hear any distortion. Overall, it's obvious that Tripowin put an emphasis on mid-bass response. Sub-bass is slightly elevated in comparison. There's at best average separation in clarity between sub-bass and mid-bass. Tripowin doesn't really say much about the mid's response. My test suggests that the Mele has slightly recessed mids due to the mid-bass emphasis. In Why Am I Like This by Orla Gartland, there's natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the song. The Mele did accentuate the vocal grain. Also, the Mele slightly accentuated the sibilance, but this was ever so slight and only greater than what I heard on the Moondrop Quarks, which I find to be neutral. There was noticeable melding between drums and guitar, and the drums overshadowed the other elements in the mix. Orla's voice stood one step behind the drums when all the instruments played at maximum. However, timbre of instruments seemed to be accurate. In Want You Back by Haim, the Mele again marginally accentuated vocal sibilance. This was only a minor difference from the neutral Moondrop Quarks. At 8 seconds into the song, the primary vocalist says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The Mele recreated this detail without difficulty. There are 2 backup vocalists, and the Mele presented both with their individual tonalities. When the instruments played at maximum, the vocalist voices melded. The backup vocalist sounded like one person. The Mele correctly rendered the timbre of the drums, piano, guitar, and bass. There was considerable melding among all these instruments. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the Mele correctly rendered the ukulele and bass. The drums seemed just a little overemphasized, sounding louder than the primary vocalist. The vocalist's sibilance rendition was smooth and, I think, neutral. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most IEMs and headphones cannot separate these voices, and the Mele could not either. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are supposed to be sharp intakes of breaths. The Mele made the breathing sound more like gasps. Overall, the mids would theoretically have been close to neutral if it wasn't for the mid-bass emphasis. That mid-bass forces the mids, especially vocals, to get pushed back. This results in a dip in the frequency response. Bassy tracks, like a lot of modern pop, hip-hop, rap, for example, will make vocals seem less clear than they would from an neutral IEM. Tripowin says they modified the BL03's treble so that the Mele has a smoother transition into it. My test suggests that the Mele has a close to neutral treble rendition with perhaps a slight roll-off in the upper treble region. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the Mele presented the brass and horns with near full energy. The higher pitched notes seemed to be a little underemphasized or rolled off. However, I could still hear the nasally signatures of these instruments. I could hear group sets, but there was noticeable melding among them. The timphony was audible and did not overpower the other instruments. The Mele is a true stereo IEM. It cannot demonstrate depth, width, or verticality. In Flat from the City, the Mele made the piano sound like it was 5 feet away. The bassy notes were clearly emphasized but did not distort. Decay was about average. I could hear the pops and sizzles and the electric buzz effects, though not all the time. The cello was smooth and clear. However, the piano's bassier notes were louder when these instruments played together. There was noticeable melding between them. I could barely hear the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 of the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the Mele presented the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass one step behind. All instruments melded with each other. The saxophone sounded smooth and seemed to lack a little bit of energy in the upper register. While it was louder than the piano, it was about shoulder to shoulder with the drums and cymbals. The cymbals are struck at different parts, which should result in slightly varied tonalities with each strike. The Mele just barely was able to present some of those varied tones. Overall, the Mele appears to have close to neutral treble with a roll-off in the upper treble region. Treble instruments tend to meld among each other, resulting in, at best, average clarity. However, listening at high volumes was never an issue. The Mele does not present piercing or harsh treble. Tripowin does not make any fantastic claims about the Mele's detail retrieval. I think that's a good thing, because had they, you'd be in for a big disappointment. The Mele appears to have, at best, average detail retrieval and clarity. This IEM tends to provide a fairly warm presentation, intimate vocals and instruments, and noticeable melding among everything. This means there's not a lot of separation among elements in a track. Multiple vocalists sound clear until drums play louder, and at that point, vocalists become harder to clearly differentiate. Pops and sizzles and electric buzz effects were sometimes audible and often not. The creaking of wood and shifting of the cello's weight was present, but a bit recessed. Sharp intakes of breath sounded more like gasps. In other words, obvious details are audible. Subtle details rarely are. I have a quantitative test for detail retrieval. I use Kazuki's song New Light, which has layers of details recorded into it, and this includes the sound of wind, rustling of grass, children playing, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and T2 Evo present 7 to 8 footsteps. The T2 Plus and Blonde BL05S present 6 to 7. The Heidi's MS2 presents 8 to 9. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6. The Moondrop Aria presents 7. The The Audio Legacy 2 provides 6 to 7 footsteps. The Moondrop Quarks provides 5 to 6 footsteps. The Blonde BL03 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. And the Mele presents 5 to 6 footsteps. For my detail resolution scale, I use the Moondrop Aria and the Starfield as the average performers. Any IEM that provides more or less footsteps is judged accordingly. Thus, on my scale, the BL03 would be considered below average and the T2 would be above average. The Mele's performance in this regard is no different from the BL03. It's below average to at best average depending on the clarity of your recording. The Mele soundstage is not particularly wide. Indeed, the bass emphasis combined with the apparent slight treble roll-off results in some diminished clarity and separation. No matter what genre I listen to, the Mele never rendered depth, verticality, or width. Certainly drums were louder than other elements in a mix, but that's not an issue of placement. Just as with the detail resolution test, I also have a scale for soundstage. For me, this involves, yet again, using the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Anything that has greater or lesser soundstage is judged accordingly. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 has above average soundstage. The Heidi's MS2 is similar to the T2 in this regard. The Blonde BL03 and 05S are average at best and perhaps slightly below average in soundstage depending on proper fit. The Starfield, Aria, and Quarks are about average. The Mele soundstage is very similar to that of the BL03 and the 05S. In other words, at best, this is average. The Blonde BL03 has a balanced sound signature. You might love it or hate it, but it's something a lot of people gravitate towards for one reason or another. Tripowin's goal was to take that tuning and make some changes. They claim to have increased the BL03 sub-bass, decreased the mid-bass, and made the treble smoother. Well, the Mele is still on the bassier side of tuning. Now, it's not a bass head IM, not by a long shot, but it's also not neutral. I think sub-bass is marginally above neutral. Mid-bass gets a noticeable emphasis and it tends to overshadow the sub-bass and the mids. Clarity in the bass region is maybe average at best. There's little bass detail to be gleaned out of the Mele, however. The mids could be neutral or very close, but for that mid-bass emphasis. I read one person say that the Mele's bass does not bleed into the mids. I have to disagree. I think it does. In fact, that's probably one reason why vocals sound full and intimate. But on the flip side, when songs use drums heavily, vocals become a bit veiled, pushed back, and recessed. When recordings have a lighter touch with bass, you can hear average clarity and detail, and vocals stand out easily. There's very little sibilance emphasis with the Mele, but noticeable melding of instruments. Treble is close to neutral. However, there is a slight roll-off at the upper treble region, I think. It's just enough to hear when doing an A-B comparison with more neutral gear. Brass and horns sound full, but lack some energy in their higher pitched notes. Separation and clarity of treble instruments is, at best, average. The Mele has at best average soundstage and below average detail on most occasions. This IEM does not have depth or verticality or width, it's simply a stereo presentation. What does this lead to? Well, the Mele is an interesting tuning, I think. You get an emphasized bass that isn't really bass head level, but is clearly capable of overshadowing other portions of the frequency range. You get mids that sound full, though not particularly detailed or clear. You get treble that is, in my opinion, gentle. It's a balanced sound signature. If you look at the frequency response charts for the Mele, you might get the impression that this is a V-shaped signature. I don't think that's really the case. Yeah, the mids are recessed due to the bass emphasis, but treble doesn't sound harsh or piercing. I try to do comparisons of products as often as possible. That's the only way to figure out where a new product actually fits. Here, we will compare the Mele to the Moondrop Quarks, the Blonde BL03, and the Moondrop Aria. I used all IEMs with their stock accessories. I plugged them into my passive AB switch. That switch was plugged into my RME 80i2 DAC and also my Modi Liquid Spark stack. I tried to volume match. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The Quarks appear to have more neutral sub-bass. The Mele, in comparison, has longer reverberation and greater emphasis. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is more obvious on the Quarks. Mid-bass impact is harder on the Mele. The mids have some similarities. The Mele is close to neutral in tonality but does have a slight emphasis in sibilance. The Quarks, in contrast, are more neutral. Vocals are clearer and stand out further ahead of instruments on the Quarks. Separation among mid-centric instruments is more obvious on the Quarks. Timbre, I think, is the same. However, drums tend to outshine other elements in a mix with the Mele. Treble is more neutral on the Quarks. The Mele, in comparison, seems to have a slight reduction in the upper treble region. Clarity and separation is a little bit more obvious on the Quarks. Timbre seems to be similar on both. The Mele has about the same amount of detail retrieval as the Quarks, but slightly smaller soundstage. The BL03, contrasting with the Mele, has closer to neutral sub-bass and mid-bass, though it is not actually neutral. The Mele, by comparison, has an obvious deviation from the BL03. The Mele sub-bass is clearly more pronounced. There's also greater melding between sub-bass and mid-bass on the Mele, and the BL03 appears to have a bit more clarity in this region. Mid-bass impact sounds a little bit blunted on the Mele, but sharper on the BL03. The mids are closer to neutral in tonality on the Mele. The BL03, by comparison, has noticeably greater emphasis in vocal grain and sibilance. Vocals are a little clearer, more separated from instruments on the BL03. The Mele's bass emphasis, when drums are emphasized in a mix, tend to push vocals back a step. On the BL03, those same vocals appear more shoulder to shoulder with the instruments, including drums. The BL03 has a treble emphasis. It starts, I think, in the mid-treble region. The Mele has a fairly neutral treble with a roll-off near the upper treble region. Instruments tend to stand out more on the BL03 and have more energy and slightly more clarity. The Mele has a gentler presentation. The Mele's detail retrieval and soundstage is pretty much the same as the BL03's. The Aria's sub-bass is emphasized, but not quite as much as the Mele's. The Mele seems to have a few decibels additional bass presence. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is more obvious on the aria. The Mele seems to have harder mid-bass impact. The aria is marginally clearer in the bass region. The mids are differently presented on both IEMs. The aria accentuates sibilants a little more than the Mele. Vocal grain, however, is similar. Vocals are a little clearer on the aria, while on the Mele they tend to get pushed back a step when drums are emphasized. Mid-centric instruments all appear to have the same timbre. Clarity is about the same. Treble response is similar between the Mele and the aria. The aria, I think, has a bit more energy in the lower treble region. Detail of treble instruments was hard to distinguish. The aria and Mele have very similar clarity and separation in the treble region. Neither IEM becomes harsh even at high volumes. The aria has greater detail in Soundstage than the Mele. Comparisons help us determine if there's any meaningful differences among products. Hype often carries things too far, and it's fairly common for people to throw money away at gear that is a rehash of what came before. The Mele is a unique sounding IEM. I'm sure there's something else out there that mimics what the Mele does. After all, there are countless IEMs floating around that you're bound to stumble onto something that matches. If these comparisons and tests show anything, then I can confirm that the Mele sounds different from the Quarks, the BL03, and the aria. The differences were obvious when I compared the Mele to the Quarks and the BL03. However, when we compare the Mele to the aria, the differences are not quite so sudden. The one aspect about the Mele that is consistent has to do with its bass response. The Mele's mid-bass is easily more pronounced than what I heard on the Quarks, the BL03, and the aria. If I had to choose a competitor that comes closest to the signature of the Mele, I think I'd choose the aria. It's not an exact match, but I do hear a similarity in tuning. Overall, you may hate all of these options, like one of them, or just feel indifferent about the whole thing. There's a large following behind Blonde's products, especially the BL03. New and experienced audiophiles seem to gravitate towards that IEM. Generally, they feel that the $40 price tag for the BL03 is a bargain for the sound quality. I disagree with that sentiment. The BL03 and the BL05S have hands down the worst accessories of any IEM I have ever used, worse even than a pair of $5 IEMs that I reviewed earlier this year. By the time you pay for a moderately acceptable cable and comfortable ear tips, you can easily see the price of the BL03 double. While you can be perfectly happy with the BL03 without putting in any more money, the actual cost after paying for replacement accessories is probably closer to $70 or $80. There are, of course, a lot of people who love the BL03 sound signature, but there are also plenty of those who dislike that IEM's sibilant and shouty vocals, lack of clarity, and treble emphasis. The BL03 is not an IEM for everyone, just like any other product. So, when Tripowin decided to take the BL03 and improve upon it, they had a lot of things they could have worked on. For example, Tripowin could improve on the BL03's design and fit, accessories, and have altered the sound signature to address some of the complaints about the BL03. Was Tripowin successful? Well, yes, in a way. The Mele, although bulky, is a fairly lightweight IEM, and even though it does not have a form-fitting design, it's a lot easier to wear than the BL03. The Mele's accessories are a night and day difference from what Blonde haphazardly threw into their packaging. The Mele comes with a spacious and sturdy case, good ear tips, and a cable that is one of the best I've seen and felt at any price category. Tripowin's goal of adjusting the BL03 sound signature did come true. I mean, the Mele does have a noticeably different sound than the BL03. But I cannot tell you whether it's good or bad, better or worse. That's an entirely subjective experience. The Mele has a warmer bass than the BL03. The mid-bass seems a bit blunted compared to the BL03. The Mele's mids are closer to neutral, but they are easily overshadowed by the bass. On the BL03, the mids are sibilant and grainy, but still reasonably clear. The Mele's treble is close to neutral with a slight roll-off at the upper range. The BL03 has a treble spike. Both IEMs have similar soundstage and detail. You will have to judge whether the Mele complements or contradicts the BL03. This brings us to value. At $50, the Mele is clearly value. There's no doubt in my mind. The Mele has robust construction, its accessories are perfectly agreeable, and its cable is a surprising inclusion. The Mele sound signature might or might not appeal to you. After all, if you like vocals upfront and clear, separated from instruments, then the Mele will not consistently provide that experience. If your tracks use drums and bass lines, then the Mele will definitely accentuate them, to the extent that vocals may become a bit recessed. On the other hand, the Mele I think has a unique sound. If it wasn't for that emphasized bass, the rest of the frequency response would be much closer to neutral tuning. And I think the Mele's slight treble roll-off might actually be pleasant for a lot of people. Ultimately, the Mele has a pretty different sound signature from some of the other popular competition. You might not love it, but you'll at least get a different experience of your music from it.